So here we are with history. And as Merrilyn and I talk, we talk back and forth about invisible women's history that exists down here, right? The first one we're going to talk about is Florence Hardy. You want to start, kid?
Okay. All right, let me see if I can you hear me now? You can all hear me. Okay, well, Florence Hardy. You all probably heard about Florence Hardy Park, which is down on Andrews Avenue. That's where the South Side School is. Florence Hardy was well, who's Florence Hardy? Why does she have a park named after her? I mean, who the heck was she? What did she do? Well, she was city clerk. She was a city auditor. At one time, she was a temporary city manager. She worked for the city for about 35 years. She originally came down here from New England. She was originally from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and then I think she lived in Massachusetts for a while. Then she and her husband was a pharmacist. They came to Florida, and they came down here as tin can tourists. And I don't know if you people know what the tin can tourists were, but this was back in the 20s and the 30s. People had their cars, and some of them, they fixed them up and made them into campers. And they came down here, and most towns had campgrounds where the tourists could come, and they didn't have to stay in a hotel, that they could run out of space in the little campground. And that's where Florence and her husband, William, they came down here in their tin can tourism car, and they set up camp over there on South Side where the South Side School is, because that was the public campground in those days.
That's where the park is now.
That's where the park is.
So the park is where the original campgrounds, where they stayed when they came.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And while they were looking around, they were trying to decide, well, do we want to stay in Fort Lauderdale so they could look around? He wanted to see if he could establish his pharmacy business, and she needed to probably get some work. So basically, she originally went to work for the bank here in town. It was First National Bank, Fort Lauderdale, which was over here in the old Sweet Building. If you people know what the Sweet Building is, it's the one that's over here by Andrews Avenue. It was the first skyscraper here in Fort Lauderdale. It's still there, 9 stories high. Now it's mostly office buildings, but basic offices. But in those days, it was First National Bank. Well, she worked there for a while. And then the then city manager needed a secretary, so he hired her. And it was going to be a temporary job, but it lasted for 35 years. Well, Florence was basically an archivist at heart. And she was a researcher. She enjoyed history. She knew about it. She collected information while she was working for the city. She kept clipping files, that is, she clipped the newspaper every day. Anything that was of interest that might be from to do with Fort Lauderdale that might be of historic interest at some time in the future. And she kept this up for all the years that she was working for the city. And when she finally retired 35 years later, well, at that point, they were deciding, a bunch of people had decided that they wanted an historical society. August Burghardt and Phil Weidling had written a book, which was our, now we've forgotten the name of the book.
Sunshine, something with sunshine.
Oh yeah, it was actually, but basically they had written a book and they had all of this research information. They had a huge number of photographs, everything they could possibly think of, and they thought, well, what we need is some place to put it. We need an archive. We need an historical society. So a group of people got together. Mrs. Stranahan was involved. She was very interested. Florence Hardy was interested. And a whole bunch of people got together and decided that they would do a historical society. They hired a woman by the name of Betty Campbell, who happened to be a professional archivist who was living here in Fort Lauderdale. Another person who's been sort of lost to history in some ways, very good archivist. And then they also, Florence, when she retired, because she was the sort of person, I mean, she's just not going to sit around and bake cookies or.
She was a doer.
Yeah, she wanted to get out and do something. So she came down and she volunteered with the society. And this was a volunteer job that she did. She came down here and she worked every day, 5 days a week, from 9 to 5, for no pay, doing just whatever she could to keep the Historical Society going. August Burkhardt, one of the authors of the original book, Checkered Sunshine, I know my memory
There you
kicked
go,
in,
you got it.
kicked in, had been the first president of the society. Then Florence became the second president, and she was put in charge, and she came down here and she basically just took over the society. She started a newsletter, which was called the New River News. And every month, she wrote an article on Florida, Fort Lauderdale history. She would go out and she would interview somebody in town. I remember an article from the Fort Lauderdale Golf and Country Club, the very first golf pro. She went and interviewed him when he came down here in the 1920s. And actually, he came down here, it was before they even had the big Fort Lauderdale Golf and Country Club, but they had a smaller club. And talked about him and the pioneer efforts of having a golf course here in town. And then just about everything else, and did really very well-researched, well-written articles. We have a whole collection of them. A whole bunch of them have been hardbound. We have them at the Historical Society. And basically, she was the person who really got this organization up and going.
Right.
You know.
Now, what you didn't say, which is awfully important, is that she was the first woman clerk, right?
Oh, yeah,
She was the first.
the first woman clerk in
That's right,
in Fort Lauderdale.
So that's rather important.
And as in the 1950s, at one point, the city manager retired. He decided to get out of town, I guess. City managers have a tendency to do that every once in a while. So while they were looking for somebody, they needed somebody to run the place. So they decided, we're going to hire Florence. Florence is going to be our acting city manager. So she was probably the first woman city manager
She was.
in Fort Lauderdale, and maybe even in the state of Florida. Well, maybe not the first in the state of Florida, but she was certainly one of the first, I'm
Yeah.
sure. So basically, this was a very serious lady, a very important lady, and had a lot to do with that.
Absolutely. Now, what we have here is a wonderful plaque.
And this was a plaque that was given to Florence by her peers. What she was so outstanding for that she could do, and this is really hard work, regardless of whether it was a Republican or a Democrat that came to her for information, she just gave it to them. She wasn't political, and she kept her cool. And believe me, when you got into some very hot situations in this town, the fact that she was as cool and even-handed as she was ended up with her colleagues giving her this plaque. Now, this plaque was a mystery. When I was doing the writing and the research, we couldn't find this plaque. Historically, this plaque was put outside her office in the original post office, and when the new city offices, moved on, changed, this plaque disappeared. And you know where it disappeared to? It was here. So here it is, X number of years later, and we dearly hope that it gets put up someplace in the facilities here that really honored the fact that she collected all of this information, she disseminated it in a nonpartisan, very cool way, and she helped to found this organization that we are now part of. So she was a very important lady, and yet essentially we don't really know about her, do we? Very quiet lady.
And we're going to talk about next.
Let me tell you what, I want to tell one story about, talking about the, the political things that she was involved with. At one time, she was the city clerk back in the days when we were fighting segregation down here. And the Fort Lauderdale Golf and Country Club, there was an attempt, well, a successful attempt to, it was actually a public golf club. And there was a group of African-American golfers who wanted to use the facilities. They were willing to use them on a segregated basis, you know, using them at, I don't know, some odd hours or at maybe one day a week or something.
Part of it, yeah.
Something like that. But in order to do that, they decided instead, there were a group of people who decided that they wanted to take the golf course private, to consider it to be a very private, become a private organization. And I know Florence Hardy was very much involved in, she was the city clerk at that time, and was very fair in order to, you know, handle this situation. But this was a serious situation that was going on. Very hot situation was going on. It went over a period of about 2 years before it was finally resolved. And there's a photograph that we have, a newspaper photograph. We don't have the original photograph, unfortunately. But it shows her and the mayor. The mayor, by the way, was opposed to selling off the court, selling off the club. But it shows the two of them when he had to sign off on it when it was finally voted out that they would sell it. So there's a picture of Florence Hardy there and the mayor, both of whom I think were a little bit opposed to it, but they ended up having to sign off on it. But that was just one of the things. Russell, I think was his name. Was his name Russell? I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think so. It was. I never can remember his name. He was very, which is, I'm very bad at names, unfortunately. I think it was John Russell, but I think it was. Yeah, it was. He was. Started off that he was first in favor of it, but as it went on over 2 years, he finally decided, no, this is not right, and opposed it. And oddly enough, he ran for election during this time, and he was overwhelmingly reelected. So there were a lot of people in town who were not happy with the situation, but nevertheless, it did prevail. It was a very difficult situation, and Florence Hardy was a rock during the whole thing.
She was a fabulous gal.
When were women allowed to play the golf course?
I think they could play, you know, at certain times during, from the beginning in the 1920s. I think we have, you know, they had women's tournaments and things like that.
Never on Wednesday.
Never on Wednesday.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was certain hours, I think. They were not allowed to play all the time, but they got there a little bit before the African Americans.